mess around with this right here. Is this, oops. All right, we're live here. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I know we got a lot of games going on, so if you got your headpiece in and your cell phone out, you'll be just like my kids during sixth period today when they came in with their laptop computers, because they all have laptop computers, and they all walked in with their screens open like this because they're watching the Iowa game. And so far be it from me to say, put your computers away. So I says, because they're in the shop, I said, you guys got to watch the game. I said, so get your cell phones out, watch the game right there, but, keep working. So they're all watching the game, working and stuff, so you guys can have Bible study and listen to the games at the same time, too. If sixth graders can do it in the shop, then you guys can do it in Bible study. Okay, we got two sets of notes, same as last week. One is wrath and worldly principles. We'll get into that, or philosophies. We'll get into that a little bit later. But we're actually on this set of notes called Ages and Cycles. If you're looking for the notes online, they're the same notes as we had last week. So a person could go on generationword.com, just scroll down where it says Monday night class, which is last Monday night's class. You got two sets of notes. One is Ages and Cycles, and the other is Wrath and Worldly Philosophies. On the Ages and Cycles, what we talked about last week was the dispensations or institutions God started. We have basically 7 of them, and they're designed for the well-being of mankind, for the structure of mankind's life throughout history. And to abandon these is to abandon yourself to chaos. That's just basic life. I mean, you don't even need to be a Bible teacher to know these things. Now again, when I say know these things, the common understanding of general revelation will recognize the importance of these things. If a person is in rebellion towards reality, which is rebellion towards the truth, rebellion towards God, or they're finding their own truth, or they think everybody's got their own truth, that's as ridiculous as saying everybody's got their own universe. You may have your own soul, your own intellect, your own body, your own ideas, but all of that still fits into this big bubble called reality, called truth, called God's creation. So you have to figure out with your little world right here, you got to realize you live in this bigger bubble, and you have to bring into alignment your reality, your insight into the real world, God's truth. That's called education. That's called seeking God. That's called maturing. That's called learning, growing. That's called increasing your knowledge. But to just stay an infant in your thinking, an infant in your soul, and demand everything revolve around your own infant understanding, that's ridiculous. And that's called postmodernism, of where we're kind of at right now. The first institution God created was self-responsibility. The individual is got their own will. They've got their own ability to make choices, but they're also responsible for those choices. Next, we're going to have the family. Marriage. Marriage is the next institution. It's not good for a man to be alone. It's good to have partnership, friendship, and this was marriage. God created sexuality. Far be it from us to demand that that's a truth, but science has held that position for thousands of years until the last few decades. The scriptures teach that, and marriage is the second institution for the well-being of mankind. And then after self-responsibility, marriage, and then you have family. The marriage is going to produce more people, more individuals, more children. Those children are going to grow up with parents in a family, in a structured environment, and learn how to manage themselves with individual responsibilities. All of the nation's problems that we've got right now can be traced back to these basic things right here that you can see on this set of notes right here, Ages and Cycles. If you look at the third page, there's the chart with some Bible verses. We looked at the verses last week. Individual volition, marriage, family, that holds everything together. I mean, seriously, you can slice and dice things however you want to, But if everyone would grow in their own individual volition, you've got your own free will, but you're responsible for your choices. You get the rewards and you get the punishments or the consequences of those choices. You can have marriage. That's people joining together in a union, different than any other relationship, then they produce a family. If these things are solid, your nation, your culture, your environment, your life will be solid. If you can't handle individual volition, you will not be able to manage marriage. And God help us if you're in charge of the children that you're raising in a broken home with no individual responsibility. When this person's got no individual responsibility and they go into the institution of marriage with no individual responsibility, with another person with no individual responsibility or accountability, and they begin to produce more people, there's no hope in just this line of thinking for an individual to come out of a family which is led by people with no individual responsibility. It's just a spiral into chaos. There is always hope for individuals to recognize that, because God is real in reality, God is real in His Scriptures, and God can speak and lead anybody out of any situation. But if you've got an entire culture built on this, you're going to have very few individuals. Next, with all these families, God is going to then He established government to help them function. Government is going to be something that will have laws, rules, and regulations that oversees the whole thing. We saw that last week. Did we get that far last week? We didn't get that far last week. So if you look on your notes, on page 2, this is after the flood. And if you go to Genesis chapter 9, and man, now again, we're just in the chapter 9 of Genesis, and again, I don't want to bore you with this, but it is where it was established. And again, like we talk about, the world in the Garden of Eden was different than the world after the fall of man. The world before the flood was different than the world after the flood. In fact, God is adding institutions here as mankind goes through history. So we are on 1, 2, 3, 4, government. Yeah, there we go. Okay, Genesis chapter 9. And when they get off the ark, God gives them this command. He establishes several things, but one of the things He establishes for them is life of animals and life of mankind. They're not supposed to just waste all the life of either animals or man, particularly for mankind. It says, in chapter 9, beginning in verse 5, and for your life blood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal, and from each man too I'll demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. God is demanding an accounting for the life of his fellow man. Now, if you notice, when Cain killed Abel, there was no court. Adam didn't do anything about it. It was under God's jurisdiction. God made the judgment call, and God put a mark on Cain, and it led him into his own situation. At this point right here, the world had become corrupt, and God now is going to establish government, and it says, by man, if we read on, it says, by man shall man's blood be shed. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man. So there's going to have to be not a vigilante, not just, like gang warfare or cartels fighting on the border shooting each other. There has to be some kind of and you can see the government is going to be defined throughout the Bible. It's going to be defined in Proverbs. You're going to have a great example of a government being set up by God on Mount Sinai for how government, He gives you rules, regulations, from the smallest things to the elaborate things. Here He's talking about one of the greatest crimes, which is murder. And if a man sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. So this idea that God is the ultimate judge, which is true, and man commits a crime down here. Now watch, this is how far away we are from the biblical truth, from the biblical reality. We would like to think that if a man on earth commits murder and kills another man, well, far be it from us to bring a judgment on that man and hold him accountable, because everyone sins. Who are we to judge? We'll let God be the judge. That's nice. That's a great idea. If you're going to create your own religion, you may want to suggest that, throw that out on the table for discussion. But right here in Genesis 9, it says, if man sheds man's blood, that man, his blood will be shed by man. Man is the one that is accountable for the murderer. Who said that? Watch this. God does not say, I'll take care of it. He says, you are responsible for the man who sheds blood in your community, under your government. That's God. Now you go to the law of Moses, it was exactly like that. It is not Christian to say, it is not Christian. If you read the New Testament, if you read the Old Testament, if you read the law of Moses, if you listen to Jesus talk, if you listen to Paul talk, it is not Christian to say it's not the government's responsibility to execute murderers or to execute those who are guilty of capital punishment. Someone's wanted, they get all lofty and lovey, and it's like we're beyond that. Well, you're beyond reality, because in reality there are cruel people, violent people, murderers in the world, and the person who's accountable for them is mankind, is responsible to hold them accountable. That is the institution of government. Now, I'm not going to spend the whole night explaining that, but we've got Jesus talking about it. You've got Paul explaining it in Romans. You've got Paul standing in court himself saying, if I'm worthy of death, if I've committed a crime worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But he says, I haven't done anything worthy of death. So Paul even says there is capital punishment, and put himself under that same judgment, but says, I haven't committed a capital crime. So Paul was allowing it. Jesus talked about it. The law of Moses has it. Now again, there are regulations. It talks about witnesses. It talks about trials. And then someone's going to say, well, yeah, but what happens if someone innocent is executed? What happens if there's a mistake? Okay, well then let's get rid of the entire institution of government. How about if there's a family with a bad father? We should get rid of families. What happens if there's a marriage with a wife who's not faithful? Let's get rid of marriage. What happens if we find someone who can't be held accountable because they don't have the mental capacity to hold themselves accountable? They need help. Well, then no one's responsible. I mean, that's not an argument, because there's somewhere in the system of a government, there's a mistake made in law and order. It doesn't mean we bulldoze government any more than we bulldoze family, and that's what we're doing. We're looking for one little mistake in government so we can get rid of government, find some mistake with family, get rid of family, and we're deconstructing. Now, once you deconstruct this, okay, you've deconstructed this system. It is now your responsibility to find something to replace individual responsibility, something to replace marriage. I mean, people are going to have sex. Sex is going to produce children. Where are you going to put the children? How are you going to hold people accountable and faithful to each other? Well, we're not going to have marriage. Well, what is it going to be? Well, now you've got a bunch of children coming from these people that are having sex, that you've created marriage, and now where are you going to put these children? And now they're going to grow up, and who's going to supervise all of this? Well, we don't want government. You've got a free-for-all. Like someone one time in one of my Bible classes, they raised their hand and says, well, government is evil. God wants everyone to live freely and individually without the government telling them what to do. Okay, now there are good forms of government. There are corrupt forms of government. But God is the one who created government. Imagine if there was no government. I mean, just imagine the chaos. Imagine if no one's responsible all the way through. No, there's no individual responsibility, no marriage, no family, and no government. If you're going to deconstruct those, you're going to have to replace those with something. Anyway, that's what takes place in Genesis, and we could spend a lot of time talking about that and going down the responsibility of government. One of the fallacies, one of the problems with the corruption of the modern United States is the idea that they entertain that the government is not going to be able to hold anyone accountable for murder. We're not going to execute anyone for. Moses says very clearly, the murderer will be put to death so that the fear of the Lord will fall upon the land. I mean, if there are people that are held accountable, that is going to be a checks and balance. It's natural. Well, that's not the way it works. You can always find some isolated situation where it doesn't work that way, but that is the way it was laid out. When you deconstruct these things, including government, you're heading into chaos. Next, after that, you've got the fifth institution after 1, the individual. 2, marriage. 3, family. 4, government. The next one, again, like I said, when I wrote the book, Hope for America's Last Generation in 2007, I don't know, it's probably about a paragraph, because I thought, it's not even worthy developing this, because it's not even an issue. Now, if I know I'm right. Now, I can always be wrong, and I always am looking over my shoulder, wondering, am I making a mistake? Am I getting too aggressive? Am I being too opinionated? Am I balanced? And then things like this happen, and I think, my gosh, I'm right on target. Now again, I'm always judging myself. Because I start talking and teaching and mouthing off in this kind of a culture. Cancel culture is all around. And then you say something stupid. It's like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm right and going to get canceled, or maybe I'm just flat out wrong and don't know what I'm talking about. That is an option. And I'm always looking over my shoulder. How far off am I? But in 2007, I'm writing about these institutions for Hope for America's Last Generation. Yeah, who was talking about America's last generation in 2007? Well, I was talking about it in 1990. Who's talking about this being America's last generation now? It's a topic. It's a topic. People realize we may be at the end. But in 2007, I'm talking about individual responsibility, the importance of marriage. Everybody focus on the family is right here. The importance of government and how we can't corrupt government. But nationalism, USA, or whatever country you're from. It's not just the United States of America that should be nationalistic and support their country. Everybody who's involved in the country should be supporting their country, and nations should respect each other just like families should respect each other. But there is such a thing as nationality. Nations with borders. Within those borders, a government that helps supervise and protect the families who are based on marriage, which is based on individual responsibility. So nationalism is obviously an important part of the institutions God established. That was 2007. Now this would be an entire book to explain nationalism to our culture, because nationalism is now evil. Nationalism is evil, and we're going to watch. You're watching it happen. If this works if this is the correct list, you're going to watch nationalism become evil, government telling people what to do, which is evil. Now families are going to become evil because not everyone's got a family, and so your family is evil because you've got some kind of family privilege. That's going to come back on marriage. Just because you're married doesn't mean you're anything special. This is going to be attacked as some kind of evil institution that's oppressing people that aren't married. And then all of a sudden, individual responsibility, you're not going to be able to hold anybody accountable. This is going to just backtrack until we deconstruct everything. And when you get up here, what are you going to do? This is happening already in waves of working through this whole thing. It's not a flat-out attack on all individual responsibility, but it is out there. It's a wave. It's like a rising tide, and all this is going to be wiped out. 2007, I wrote a little bit about nationalism, but it wasn't that big of a deal. Who needs to be told nationalism is kind of, God-created nations. Nations are not evil. When Jesus comes back, he's going to judge the nations, but he's not going to eliminate the nations. He's going to judge the nations and set up leadership in those nations, and they will continue into his kingdom. There will be nations in the kingdom. There will be governments with leaders that come to visit Jesus in Jerusalem. The governments from the nations will send leadership to him, and he'll oversee the governments and the nations. He's going to be King of Kings. He's not just the only king. He's the king over all the kings. So he created nations. He's going to continue with nations. And where you see nations is going to be in, you can see the next verse right there is Genesis chapter 10 and 11. And you've got in chapter 10, it's entitled in my NIV Bible, the Table of Nations. And you've got where all the different nations came from Japheth, from Ham, from Shem, and where all the different nations came from. And then in chapter 11, it gives you this story, the Tower of Babel. And before people laugh at the Tower of Babel, and there was only one language, and all the different people scattered because the language got confused, you may want to do a little bit of study on language and realize how accurate this story is. And how it is founded in a historical location. And now it says, now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, chapter 11, verse 3. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Right there, they were wanting to make a name for themselves. They were trying to change history, change environment, change reality into their own plan. We're going to make a name. This is the way it is. Come, let's change this into this new reality. We're going to make a name for ourselves. Now, it's interesting. They wanted to make a name for themselves in chapter 12. Just flip over to chapter 12. In chapter 12, God calls Abram, chapter 12, verse 2. He gives him a promise. We're going to come to this in just a minute. I will make you into a great nation, he tells Abram, and I will bless you. I will make your name great. In chapter 11, they said, come, let us make a name for ourselves. And God says, no, you're not changing reality. And he backed them up into where he wanted them to be created nations. Then he comes to Abraham and says, now I'm going to make you into a nation, and I'm going to give you a name. The very thing they try to do in chapter 11 in rebellion towards God, God says, Abram, you're going to follow me, and I'm going to make your name great. So what they try to do in chapter 11, Abraham is given in chapter 12. And if you look in chapter 11, going back there, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, now this is a scary, scary verse. If as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. If they unite, if somehow mankind can unite with, this gives you an insight into the ability of man, the creativity, the intellectual ability of mankind unified universally in a purpose. Nothing will be impossible. That is not my idea. That is not a potential. That is not man in the unfallen state. That is God the Lord coming down and observing this, seeing his creation being united against him and against his plan for history. He says, my gosh, if they unite as one people with one language, nothing's going to stop them. He had to intervene in that event and cause confusion. He had to scatter them. And how he's going to cause the confusion here, he's going to cause the confusion of language. And he says right here, come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other. So with this he's forming the nations, and it's going to come out of confusion. In other words, if you read this backwards, the nations are God's way of confusing mankind from uniting and creating his own reality and against God's reality and rebelling against God's entire plan. God is going to bring confusion, which is going to cause the nations to be formed. They're not going to understand each other. Not just not going to understand the language, I don't understand what you're saying, but as they had us drift apart, they're going to begin to form different cultures. Different types of, and I don't want to say values, but different traditions, different lifestyles, different cultures. And why does this culture do that? And they're going to have a difference in cultures. A variety of cultures is God's plan. You can appreciate other cultures, but culture